யாதும் ஊரே யாவரும் கேடீர்.
செம்மொழி வலையொலி யூடியூப் சேனல். இந்த சேனலின் மூலமாக, அந்த வலையொலியின் மூலமாக பல்வேறு தகவல்களை தினந்தோறும் நாங்கள் வழங்கி கொண்டிருக்கக்கூடிய அந்த நிலையில் சிலப்பதிகாரம் என்ற தலைப்பில் ஒவ்வொரு பகுதியாக வழங்கக்கூடிய அந்த தொகுப்பை முழுமையாக கண்டு பார்க்கலாம்.
The title of this paper is Puranaanooru Heroic Poetry. It is a rejection of Kailasapathi's well-known contention that Puranaanooru belongs to the heroic age. It may be fruitful to examine Puram poems in the light of what the Western literary historians have said about the heroic age and oral poetics. As early as the last decade of the 19th century, the Russian scholar Radlov, studying the Tatars of Central Asia, identified certain elements of production employed by the bards of heroic poetry. They consisted of themes, situations, catalogues, topoi or descriptions of the birth of a hero or of weapons, portraits of people and the beauty of a bride. In the presence of an audience, a bard, mixing these static components with lines invented for the nonce, recited his poems. The Chadwicks, in their monumental work called The Growth of Literature, pointed out that in the heroic age, literature must have consisted of records of intellectual activities preserved in speech, not in writing, and that it continued to supply themes when later new literary forms grew up as a man's memory served as his library. The heroic records, for the sake of analysis, might be divided into 5 types: narrative poetry, poems whose interest lies in emotional situations arising from adventure rather than in adventure itself; then lyrics, odes, poems of didactic interest, elegies, panegyrics, poetry of invocation, exhortations to battle, celebrations of victory, and personal poetry. The most striking element in the religion of classical Greece, according to H.M. Chadwick, is the worship of heroes. Every city had shrines at which sacrifices similar to the ones for chthonic deities were offered to heroes. Many of these heroes were local persons whose tombs became shrines. But the protagonists of heroic poetry were sometimes worshipped in many different states. Thirst for fame during one's lifetime and in afterlife is one of the major themes of Greek and Teutonic heroic poetry. There is also evidence to indicate that a belief approximating to the doctrine of Valhalla was prevalent during the heroic age. It was not lawful for a man of the period to die of old age or disease. When he felt that he was dying, he would request his relatives to kill him as early as possible. They would then construct a huge pyre and place him at the highest part of it so that he might be stabbed to death by a compatriot. The dead man's wife would also be required to strangle herself at the tomb. Another notable feature of heroic poetry is that it never brings into prominence the national aspect of war. The heroes fought to achieve personal glory and to display personal prowess. They were also motivated by the desire for plunder of women and cattle. The hero, wanting to outshine all his rivals in splendor, desired wealth not to live a life of comfort or to gain a position of influence, but to display it. Milman Parry called the Darwin of Homeric studies, juxtaposing Homer and modern Yugoslav bards, pointed out the similarities in their techniques of oral verse making insofar as they drew on a repertoire of formulas, patterns, themes and type scenes. In the oral tradition, the bards liberally helped themselves from the stock of metrically fitting phrases such as the epithet plus noun to describe heroes, objects, animals and birds. Examining the first 25 lines of the Iliad and the Odyssey, he identified the traditional formulas used in them and got repeated in the rest of the epics. Defining a formula as a group of words which is regularly employed under the metrical conditions to express a given essential idea, he demonstrated how it fills just the space in the verse which allows it to be joined to the phrases which go before and after and which with it make the sentence. In his heroic poetry, C.M. Baura describes the salient features of the heroic age and of its oral narratives. At most times and in most places, heroic poetry is treated seriously by social historians as it is taken to be a repository of facts. Heroic poetry exists in many parts of the world and has existed in many others because it answers a real need of the human spirit. The heroic age is one which believes in the pursuit of honor and expresses its admiration in a poetry of action and adventure, of bold endeavors and noble examples. Every society in the heroic age held that life of action is superior to the pursuit of profit or the gratification of the senses, and that the man who seeks honor is himself an honorable figure. It is not enough for a man to possess superior qualities, he must realize them in action. In the ordeals of life, the hero's full worth is tested and revealed. It is not necessary that he should have achieved success. The hero who dies in battle after doing his utmost is in some respects more admirable than the hero who lives. He is honored because he has made a final effort in courage and endurance. Honor is central to a hero's being, and when it is questioned or assailed, he has to assert himself. The assertion of honor need not always be fierce and bloodthirsty. It may be equally effective if it is quiet. Since the ideal of action appeals to a large number of men and provides enthralling experience, it becomes matter for poetry of a special kind. Baura observes that heroic poetry is essentially narrative and nearly always remarkable for its objective character. It wins interest and admiration for its heroes by showing what they are and what they do. The actions related in heroic poetry are primarily those of human beings, not of gods and goddesses. Almost without exception, heroic poetry is mainly intended for a listening and not a reading public. Anonymity is a characteristic of heroic poetry. Explaining the anonymity of oral poems, Baura contends that each poem has one existence when it is recited, when the audience knows who the poet is. Heroic songs may be sung by kings and princes also. Though bards sing for kings and princes, their songs are enjoyed by the whole gathering and create a special diversion in courtly life. The bards are satisfied with giving a new variation of an old tale. Their main task is to maintain a tradition in the correct way. As heroic songs are an important link between the ruler and the ruled, whose common interest in war they reflect, they are more than a mere pastime. In war, the bard comes into his own more than in peace, since he is able to inspire his own countrymen against the enemy by singing songs of their glorious past. Fighting is, of course, the favorite topic of heroic poetry. Another notable feature of heroic narrative is that on the whole it concentrates on the happy few and neglects the others. Though heroic poetry may introduce gods into the action, its main interest is in man. Baura acknowledges the presence of written poems by literate writers even during the heroic age. Heroic poetry, he says, often exists in societies where writing is practiced in some form. The decline of heroic poetry is caused by historical developments. Foreign conquests or religious movements or cultural influences from abroad may in a short time put an end to what has endured for many centuries. Describing the poetry of the post-heroic age, Baura says that a society changes its taste and advances from the simple to the elaborate or from the communal to the personal, and that men who have been hitherto content to enjoy a traditional and conventional art now feel a need for something more original and more varied. Such findings by the Western scholars about the heroic age have tempted some of the Tamil scholars, notably K. Kailasapati, to identify the Sangam age as a heroic one. Encouraged by the suggestion of Parry that in addition to long oral narratives, even the short lyrical non-heroic pieces by writers like Homer, Hesiod, Sappho and others follow the formulaic style, the great Ceylon scholar has been quick to marshal all possible arguments to reveal the heroic nature of Tamil Puram poems. As early as 1927, N.K. Siddhanta, in his Heroic Age of India, had observed that the Puram poems in Tamil were comparable to the heroic poems in other languages. In his lectures entitled Kavya Kalam, S. Vayyaburi Pillai had stated that some of the characteristic features of the heroic age as described by Chadwick are to be found in the society pictured in the early Sangam poems. J.R. Marr, in his PhD thesis on Ettuthoggai, submitted to London University in 1958, contended that early Tamil poetry, very much like the Greek lyrics of the past, might have been of the oral tradition. Following in their footsteps, Kailasapati did further research in the area and came out with his Tamil heroic poetry, which claimed that the evidence of the early Tamil poems is very close to the findings of modern researchers of oral poetry. Analyzing the first 30 lines of Mullai Pattu, he identified a few noun epithets and formulas that get repeated in the Sangam poems. In his view, the Akavalpa of our Aham and Puram poems is in many respects similar to the hexameter of the Greek epics. Even the great Sangam poets like Kavilar, Paranar, Avayar and Mangudi Marudan are found to have repeated the words, phrases, themes, similes and metaphors used by others. Their poems, according to him, reveal no identifiable unique features but appear to have come from the same workshop, since the commonness of the style is so predominant. Motifs such as stealing the cow, burning the enemy's city and feasting are to be found in the ancient Welsh and Irish oral traditions also. Wherever there are references to songs in the Sangam corpus, they imply poems recited and not written. Words like Yappu, Kilavi, Kutru, commonly used in the past, were associated more with speech than writing. Also, Kailasapati asserts that all the 8 characteristics of heroic poetry, as discussed by C.M. Baura, are true of Tamil Puram poems. The old Tamil concepts of Nan, Pali, Aran as the distinguishing traits of heroes celebrated in them are again similar to the Greek concepts of Aidas, Nemesis and Dike, while the word Sandror, meaning the great, corresponds to the Greek Agathos. Kailasapati's conclusion, identifying Puram poems as a product of the heroic age of Tamil, has not gone unchallenged by contemporary Tamil scholarship. T.P. Meenakshi Sundaran, in what is believed to be the last of his major works, Tamil Ilakkiya Varalaru Sangakalam, gives a brief historical critical account of the golden era of Tamil literature and culture, highlighting the grandeur of Aham and Puram lyrics. His contentions, though found scattered in the small book, constitute a quiet but firm rejection of Kailasapati's thesis. He points out that Sangam literary tradition favors short individual poems but not continuous narratives, as from the Sangam age we haven't got any epics glorifying kings or great heroes. The Sangam age was one in which education flourished and literate poets from diverse castes and different walks of life were delighted to compose poems of their own. We may make bold to say that all the Sangam lyrics that are extant must have been sung by mentally well-equipped, wise poets and not by illiterate bards or minstrels. The conventions and the rules and regulations they have followed in the writing of these poems witness to their erudition. The bards might have continued to sing their own songs, but they haven't come to us in the form of anthologies as the songs of Panar, Agavan Mahal and Velan would not have enjoyed the status and prestige of the poems of Pulavar, characterized by depth of thought and complexity. According to TPM, Panar's songs in the oral tradition did influence the poems composed by the Pulavar, and that accounts for the presence of formulas, noun epithets and other such oral elements in the latter. Chadwick and Bowra have themselves accepted that the heroic age was followed by one in which poets moved from the simple to the elaborate and from the communal to the personal. The heroic age was an age of long continuous poems, an age of narratives. We have neither of these in the Sangam corpus. The heroic poem sings the past achievement of heroes. Though Sangam poems occasionally mention the great deeds of the past, they are largely about the author's contemporaries. Since the epics of the heroic age were orally transmitted from generation to generation and continued to grow in size, we attribute communal authorship to them. But the Sangam poems certainly had their individual authors. Of the total of 2,381 pieces, we don't know the names of the authors of only 102 just because the palm leaves bearing their names had been destroyed. This doesn't mean that those poems have to be treated as the authorless poems of the heroic age. TPM again demonstrates with specific examples how many of the Sangam poems reveal the characteristic qualities of individual authors. One can't mistake a Kabilar poem for one by Mamulanar. No one else writes like Palai Padiya Perungadungo. If we exclude Kalitogai, Paribadal and Tirumuruhatrupadai, we are left with 2,209 pieces which are undoubtedly of the Sangam age. Of these, 1,705 are Aham poems. Even according to Kailasapati's reckoning, only 391 Sangam pieces refer to heroes or philanthropists or others. This means that more than 70% of the extant Sangam poems have nothing to do with heroes. They portray the emotions of men and women in the grip of love. The great Tamil scholar cites numerous examples to show that Sangam poets, even when they use formulaic phrases, make the meaning profound and complex. Another feature of this poetry, not to be found in the oral tradition, is their use of Aindinai tradition, from which they gain several advantages, including brevity and economy of diction. Finally, TPM examines a few pieces to show how the Sangam poets have gone far beyond the bardic tradition, even when they glorify a king's heroism and generosity. That some of TPM's clarifications are acceptable to A.K. Ramanujan is quite evident from his afterword to his poems of love and war, where without acknowledging the source, he echoes them in a critique on Kailasapati's claims. A.K. Ramanujan also feels that in the poem a distinction is made between the Pulavar, wise men, philosopher poets, and the other bards, minstrels, dancers, Panar, Virali, and others, and that the latter are always a dramatis personae in the poems, are speakers of monologue poems, while the poems have clearly been composed by a Pulavar with a name or epithet. Repeating TPM's argument, Ramanujan observes that the authors of the poems and the nameless bards in the poems are not the same, and that the poems are too subtle to be the result of rapid composition like oral epics. Questioning the validity of Parry's belief that formulaic and traditional necessarily mean oral, Ramanujan says that in the transitional periods, writing is used by literate poets to compose new work, though the standards and techniques may be oral and formulaic. In Sangam poems, the formulaic elements are not static counters, not fixed in meaning, but quite sensitive to usage and context. To prove this point, Ramanujan mentions the formula Asagu Yendai Yandulan Kollo, where is he gone, my lord, and stay, which occurs 4 times in elegies lamenting the death of a king and of an anonymous hero, and in love poems referring to the lover who is far away. In the elegies, the question is rhetorical, for the hero is dead, but in the love poem, it is literal, since the hero's whereabouts are not known. Sangam poets are thus able to ring changes skillfully, and therefore the strict meaning of the term formula loses its rigor. Ramanujan persuasively demonstrates how the frames indicated by the colophons add subtleties and dramatic ironies. Without the colophon, a poem may be an exquisite description of man remembering his wedding night and his bride's shyness. With the colophon, it becomes a Marudham poem, a poem of infidelity. The frame provides scope for looking at the experience in more than one way. In his introduction to the English rendering of Puranaanooru, George Hart, discussing the orality of the classic, states that he does not believe that the poems are oral in the same way that the Homeric epics and the songs of the Yugoslav bards are. They are too complex to be extemporized. According to Lord, oral poetry should be crafted in such a way that each line ends a thought, and that if more lines are added, they simply add to the thought that was essentially complete in the first line. But the Tamil heroic poems often do not conform to this requirement, as we may find in certain poems a verb at the beginning of a poem and many lines later an object or subject with an extraordinary complex structure intervening. For example, in the 19th poem of Puranaanooru, the verb "didn't I embrace" comes in line 6 and the object "your chest" is in line 18. Between the verb and its object comes the detailed description of the battlefield. This structure is so complex that it cannot be rendered into English. In translating the poem, we had to separate the parts of the poem so that they made sense. It is difficult to imagine a singer extemporizing a poem as complex as this one. With regard to the other 2 elements of oral poetry, that is themes and formulas, Heart is of the view that Puranaanooru has both, though it has fewer formulas than many oral texts such as the Iliad, the Odyssey, Beowulf and the Mahabharata. All this will go to show that the Sangam period cannot be completely identified with the heroic age, and that the Sangam poet is not an illiterate reciter, but a poet endowed with the powers of observation and meditation. This means that the Tamil heroic age would have preceded Puram poems. It is interesting to note that in the very same year, that is 1968, in which Kailasapathi's book appeared, another book came out calling into question the indiscriminate application of the conclusions drawn from oral poetry by the Western scholars. In one of his articles included in the journal Purushartha, Francois Gros is highly critical of the attempt on the part of Kailasapathy and some other scholars to show that Sangam writings have the characteristic features of the poetry of the heroic age, like Homer's epics. Francois Gros contends that if Kailasapathi's book was well received in England, it might have been because it was dedicated to C.M. Baura and heavily indebted to Milman Parry for its Greek comparisons. According to the learned French critic, Italo Siciliano's book Myths, Histories, Poems, written in 1968, condemns the vain attempt to reduce great literary writings to the level of formulas of oral poetry on the basis of the ordinary qualities gathered about the ancient oral songs. Praising this scholarly work, Gros concludes that because of it, Kailasapathi's idea had become outdated even before his book was released. One can cite numerous examples from Puranaanooru to justify Ramanujan's contention that in Sangam poems the formulaic elements are not static counters, not fixed in meaning, but quite sensitive to usage and context. Ayyur Mudavanar's poem on Sodan Kulamutrathu Tunjiya Killi Valavan repeats the apostrophe Kalamsai Kove thrice, twice in the first line and once in the fourth line in a poem of 15 lines. O potter who fires pots, potter who fires pots in a kiln which shoots up a mass of blackened smoke across the vast sky, as if all darkness had been gathered into the broad and ancient city. Potter who fires pots, you are to be pitied. How can you do what you must do? He who had elephants with swaying tusks, he who was born in the line of Sembian, whose massive army poured over the earth, whose majesty was far famed, whose fine undying glory has been praised by the poets and has spread far across the sky as if it were the sun with its expanding rays. The great Valavan has reached the world of the gods, and now you want to fashion an urn large enough to enclose him. With the great Mount Meru for your clay and the wide earth for your wheel, will you be able to somehow to throw that vessel? The speaker wants to know if the potter will be able to make a pot large enough to hold the body of the king, whose everlasting fame has spread far and wide, and if he can manage to have Mount Meru for his clay and the wide earth for his wheel for such a purpose. The Thurai called Ananda Payyul sings the misery of a woman who has lost her husband. The old commentator says that what the relatives express in sympathy with a dead person would also fall within the same Thurai, and that the repetition in the poem is indicative of pity. Another poem by an anonymous poet also makes use of the same repetition in a different context. O potter who makes pots, potter who makes pots, like a small white lizard caught on the spoke of a turning wagon wheel, I have come with him across wasteland after wasteland. Take pity upon me as well, and on the wide earth spreading out in far-ranging expanses, fashion him a burial urn, one that will be large, potter who makes pots, in the ancient town, spreading out in great expanses. Though in this piece also, the phrases Kalam Seikove and Nanandalai Moodur Kalam Seikove are repeated verbatim, the translators have unfortunately translated them in different ways. Potter who fires pots in one case and potter who makes pots in another case. The epithet Nanandalai Moodur is omitted in the former poem and rendered in the ancient town, spreading out in great expanses in the latter. These are gross mistakes on the part of the translators, as the repetition by one of the two poets would have been deliberate, and Nanandalai Moodur would have certainly had a topical reference. The old commentator's observation that the repetition in the second poem is indicative of hurry is very significant. The lady that has lost her husband hurries up to the potter to throw a pot that will accommodate her together with her husband. This is obviously not a case of formulaic use of Kalam Seikove, Nanandalai Moodur, Kalam Seikove. என்போல் பெருவிதுப்பு உருக, என்போல் பெருவிதுப்பு உருக, let someone tremble like me, is a full sentence used by three Puram poets successfully, ringing the changes required. Nakkarnayar's poem is assumed to express her one-sided love for a Chola king. Because of the young warrior who wears war anklets on his legs and whose beard is the color of collyrium, the bangles hang loose on my arms and I am afraid of my mother. Yet if I should embrace those shoulders of a warrior, I may be shamed before the assembly. May this bewildered city tremble as much as I do forever, not able to choose, divided between two minds. She curses the people of the city for stopping her from embracing the strong shoulders of her warrior hero by desiring that they tremble as much as she does. The heroine of one Puranar reprimands the god of death himself for having cruelly snatched away her husband. If I start to scream, I fear that tigers may come for you. If I hug you and try to lift you up, I cannot raise your broad chest. May unjust death, who brought you pain, shiver till he is exhausted, just as I do. Take my hand, which is still dense with bangles, and we will go into the shadow of the mountain. Only walk a little while. The song of Nedunkadathu Paranar also uses the phrase, giving it a slightly changed meaning. you of lower caste, and drummers, and people skilled in song, come to the dark man wearing clothes that are pure white. Fend off the sound of the great birds, and I with the whirling melody of Billari will keep away the white foxes. May the king shudder as I do, for he took the garland woven with jewels which he was wearing, and placed it on the head of that man, eager to die for no reason, while on his own head he set that man's garland of a single strand. A woman that has lost her husband in a war feels proud of the fact that since he has sacrificed his life for the glory of the king, the latter will be as grief-stricken as she is. All the three pieces are from Puranaanooru, though they are of different thinais. The first one's Thurai is Padichudal of Kaikilai, the second one's Mudubalai of Poduyal, and the third one's Vetiyal of Karandai. It is again a failure on the part of the translator that he has not managed to retain the same English equivalent of Yenbol Peru Vidupu Uruga in all the three poems, drawing the attention of the reader to the peculiar craftsmanship of the poets. But the extremely effective utterance is translated, "May this bewildered city tremble as much as I do. May unjust death, who brought you pain, shiver till he is exhausted, just as I do. And may the king shudder as I do." What is more noteworthy is that an Aham poem also uses the same utterance, adding a new dimension to it. In a Nattinai piece by one Kayamanar, the heroine's mother curses the hero's mother for having given birth to a heartless young man who has, by uttering lies, persuaded the farmer's daughter to run away with him. Terribly upset by the news of her daughter's elopement, she expresses her desire that the hero's mother should also feel as frustrated as she is. In none of these poems does the statement occur as a formula or as a metrical requirement. It becomes an integral part of each, contributing its share to the richness of the structure and the texture of the poem, and serves to express the fusion of emotions like love, pathos, helplessness, and anger. The Sangam poets are known for the uncommon similes and metaphors they have used in their poems, whose unparalleled success largely depends on them. Some of these comparisons get repeated, but with variations indicative of the genius of the individual poet. Philanthropy, for example, is compared in poem after poem with the rain, but in no poem is the signature of the poet concerned missing. More than one poem uses Ngeli coal, Tikadai coal, a stick of kindling, as a richly suggestive simile. It is admirably used by Avvayar in one of her poems on her patron Adiyaman. She says, "If he has much food, some will be left for himself. He will give more to those who come to him in need than to those whom duty binds him to feed. He is a good companion who enjoys dining with ordinary people." This is Neduman Anji. Like a stick of kindling set into the eaves of a house, he can hold his place without displaying his strength, but like the huge fire that surges from that stick, suddenly he can show himself with his full power. A stick of kindling, when preserved in the eaves of a house doesn't show its potential, but the fire kindled by it can cause havoc. Anji appears harmless during days of peace, but reveals his tremendous strength at the time of war. Urayur Mudukutanar employs the same simile to praise the husbandry and hospitality of the leader of a small town. He says, this Mudukutanar, the strong man of the village, where men live by ploughing with their bows, and the wells are hacked out of stone to hold heavily brackish water, will be able, even when he is impoverished, to come up with what he knows he doesn't have, as if he were an ignorant cowherd in extreme cold, kindling a small fire in the faded evening. When he has something, though very little, he does not worry about there being many who come to him in need, but like a woman who is the light of her house, who deals out food in due order within a long, high pavilion, he can give away a bit here, a bit there, according to worth. But when times go well for him, as with the white rice of sacrifice poured out in front of their doors by kings who protect the world, he can, when he is needed, shower down his gifts. A cowherd in the possession of a stick of kindling can produce fire in the snowy evening if required. The philanthropic leader can come up with what he doesn't have when there is a demand on his generosity. In the song of Alattur Kidar, the fire kindled by a shepherd makes its appearance, but not as a simile. In that village with handsome families, where there is wasteland, where the dung of white sheep that have eaten kumil fruit is spread out like nuts under a pavilion with strong pillars by the light of a little fire kindled by a cowherd, the modest man of great worth who sits down with bards is a friend who knows his friend's heart and will give his life if harm threatens that king whose armies win victories. The self-possessed hero whose praise is sung by Alattur Kidar is seen in the company of bards by the light of a little fire kindled by a shepherd. A similar scene is depicted by Kadiyalur Uruthirangananaar in Perumbanatru Padai. The poem says, sometimes he plays the sweet Palai tune on a pipe whose blackened stops are held by red-hot brands that send forth smoke, enkindled by the fire, produced by sticks together rubbed. Here a cowherd makes holes in his flute by using the fire from the stick of kindling. The Sangam bards, never suffering from the Bloomian anxiety of influence, did not hesitate to employ the words, phrases, similes, and even complete sentences already used by their poetic ancestors. They were confident that they could leave their own stamp upon them. But the formulaic expressions used by Homer serve an altogether different purpose as required by oral poetry. Phrases such as windy Troy and weeping Helen get repeated, and on certain occasions the weeping Helen may not weep at all or may even smile. It may not therefore be right to claim, even on the presence of certain repeated epithets and phrases, that Puranaanooru is heroic poetry. Thank you.